Okay, hello everyone and welcome back to the Vandenberg series on the future of conservative foreign policy. In this series, we explore the varied approaches to foreign policy among the conservative national security community. Over the past several weeks, we've had a number of lively conversations with some fantastic guests, most recently with former National Security Advisor and Vandenberg board member, Matt Pottinger, who talked about the growing Russia-China axis. You can find recordings of all of our interviews on our YouTube channel, which we can drop into the chat. Today, we are pleased to welcome another member of the Vandenberg Advisory Board, Dr. Matthew Cranig. Matt is a professor at Georgetown University, the Deputy Director of the Atlantic Council Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, and the Director of the Center's Scowcroft Strategy Initiative. Matt is the author or editor of 7 books, including The Return of Great Power Rivalry, and he is currently working on another book project, which we will discuss today. So I want to remind all of our audience that you can do Q&A at any time. So please submit your questions to the Q&A box in the chat. And so without further delay, I'd like to turn it over to Matt to make a few opening remarks on his vision for the future of conservative foreign policy. So thank you, Matt.
Well, thank you very much, Amanda, for that introduction and the invitation to be here today. Thanks very much to the Vandenberg Coalition and all the great work that you do. And thanks to the participants for tuning in. Future of conservative foreign policy, this is a big topic, and I think it's a topic where there is quite a bit of pessimism right now. I think there's this sense that the Republican Party is divided. And we see that with the debates over January 6th, for example. I also think there's a sense that the kind of Trump or populist wing of the party is trampling on traditional values of conservative foreign policy. And I think that's wrong, basically. I'm an optimist by nature, and I see a vision for a future conservative foreign policy that can unite the various wings of the conservative movement. And as you mentioned, I'm working on a book on this subject right now with my colleague at the Atlantic Council, Dan Negrea, because I do think that some of the traditional principles of conservative foreign policy, going back to Reagan, if not before, still work, but that they do need to be updated with some of the insights from the Trump administration. So you can think of it as kind of a Reagan-Trump synthesis. And so maybe in my opening remarks, I'll just say a few words about what I think that synthesis looks like. So first, in security and defense, I think Reagan and Trump actually agreed in this idea of peace through strength, that the way to have security for the American people is that the United States is so strong that none of our challengers dare mess with us. But the peace part is an important part as well, to avoid costly wars of choice and to use our strength prudently. I think Trump also updated this with the idea that border security is national security. I think that that's right, and that will have to be a key pillar of any viable Republican candidate's foreign policy platform. When it comes to economic policy, international trade and investment, traditional conservative principles are for free markets. Reagan was a free trader. I think that's the establishment position, but I think Trump was also right that only works if your trade partners are playing by the rules, and China's not playing by the rules. And so I think moving from free trade to fair and reciprocal trade does make sense, and we do need a selective decoupling economically from China in sensitive national security areas and technology areas. In other areas that aren't sensitive, but China is just cheating, I think we do need reciprocal measures like tariffs. But then finally, there are areas where free trade can continue, even with China, soybeans and toys, for example, but then certainly with other open market democracies that are playing by the rules. As it relates to diplomacy, I think the traditional view is that America's allies are a great source of strength, and I think that that's right. If we think about the China competition, for example, if it's just the United States against China, it's our 23% of global GDP against China's 16 or 17%. That's too close for comfort, but if we bring in our 30 formal treaty allies, we have 60% of global GDP. If we act together, we still have the preponderance of power to really determine global outcomes. But Trump was right that there's not enough burden sharing. that this can't be a model of the United States providing these countries with security. We do need them to do more. And so I have been heartened by Poland, Germany, Romania, other countries increasing their defense spending recently. And then finally turning to values, and here's an area where I think maybe people do see the populist wing and the establishment wing at odds, but I think there are even common themes there. So, and I think the theme is essentially American exceptionalism. Reagan talked about a city on a hill. Trump talked about American greatness, making America great again. And I do think that this is a theme that's different in conservative foreign policy from, say, progressive foreign policy, where Obama said Americans think America is exceptional, just like Greeks think Greece is exceptional, which is essentially to deny the idea of American exceptionalism. In short, to wrap up, I do think that there's a vision that can unify the conservative movement again, and again, peace through strength, fair and reciprocal trade, working with allies, but more burden sharing, and belief in American exceptionalism. So I'll finish my opening remarks there and look forward to the discussion.
Great. Thank you so much, Matt, for those framing remarks. Before we dive into the book, which I'd like to do pretty early on in our conversation, where do you see the greatest fault lines within conservative foreign policy today within the movement, the primary divisions? And would you classify yourself as falling into a particular camp, or are you do you see yourself as more of a combination of various schools of thought?
Well, I think there are several debates within the conservative foreign policy community today. So one is this kind of more traditional establishment versus populist divide, but as I just tried to explain, I think they may not be as far apart as maybe the press would like us to believe, or others might like us to believe. I think one of the other big debates is the more internationalist versus isolationist, which overlaps with that first debate to some degree, but is also different. And in that camp, I definitely would put myself, or in that debate, I would put myself in the internationalist camp. I do think that American power and influence in the world is a force for good, and that it has made the world and the American people safer, richer, and freer over the past 75 years, and that the American people would suffer if the United States had a more restrained foreign policy. And then final debate, there is this debate among conservative foreign policy wonks on how to prioritize America's interest in geographical regions. And so you might categorize this as the Asia first versus the walk and chew gum debate. With the Asia first camp saying China, 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 anything else is a distraction. And I think the walk and chew gum school saying, well, US is still a global power. We still have global interests. We still have to be involved in Europe and the Middle East. And I think there I'd put myself more in the walk and chew gum camp.
Yes, and we hope to get into this Asia First debate later on in the discussion for sure. So your next book is going to be a project on the foreign policy of the next president. Where, as you mentioned, you're seeking to find a kind of common ground between the populist wing and the more establishment wing, the kind of Trump versus Reagan approach. Can you tell us a little bit about the impetus behind the book and why you decided to pursue this project?
Well, they're the kind of the practical reasons, and then the I think substantive intellectual reasons. Some of the practical reasons. I was at a conference with a prominent U.S. senator. We were getting coffee during one of the breaks, and he said to me, really what we need is a Reagan-Trump fusion. And that resonated with me, and I thought he was right. In addition, we have a donor at the Atlantic Council sponsoring this project, and so I wanted to do it for that reason. But I think substantively, I'm mostly optimistic, but I am a little bit concerned about the possibility of a cleavage within the party on foreign policy, because I don't think that's helpful. I mean, we should have diversity of views, debate, but I don't think we want to see the deep divisions that we saw during the Trump era. I don't think that was good for the party, for the conservative movement. I don't think it was good for the country or for the world. So, I think some of the traditional principles still work, but I do think that listening to the American people and some of the concerns that brought Trump to power is right. We weren't benefiting from fair trade or free trade, where we were essentially outsourcing manufacturing jobs to China. We weren't benefiting from open borders with people coming in. So how do we take the traditional principles and update them for the challenges we face today that actually meet the needs of the American people? So that's what I'm hoping to try to accomplish in this book substantively.
And what do you think will be the greatest challenges in combining these two approaches?
Well, I think that the challenge and the problem with U.S. foreign policy in general is I think often foreign policy experts, people like you and me, think about the national security challenges to the country, think about the right strategies and policies for addressing them. But too often we don't make the case to the American people and explain why do they benefit from these foreign policies? How does NATO benefit the average person in Ohio? How does a new trade agreement benefit the average person in Ohio? Take the war in Afghanistan, for example. When is the last time a U.S. president stood up and explained to the American people why we were in Afghanistan, why we think it contributed to national security? I think the Bush administration did that at least early on, but don't really remember a strong speech on that subject from Obama, from Trump, or for Biden. And so it made sense then that the kind of forever war narrative developed, that the public opinion turned against it. And so I do think that the job of politicians is to lead. And so I think the challenge here will be a conservative politician standing up and making the case for this foreign policy vision. And I do think that the American public, if they have strong leadership, can be persuaded that such a foreign policy is in not just the country's interest, but in their personal interest as well.
Great, thanks. And one other question on this very exciting book project. You're characterizing Reagan's approach as establishment, but at the time he probably conceived of himself as a kind of outsider, as did President Trump. So do you think there's anything to the fact that both of these presidents were outsiders in each of their own particular ways? Do you think that is partly why that they brought something to the table in terms of changing how we think about foreign policy?
I think there is something to that. They were both outsiders in a way, and many of the things that people were saying about Trump in 2016 were things that people were saying about Reagan in the 70s and 80s. He doesn't have experience. He's radical. He's going to get us into wars. But I do think that coming from outside, that you're more willing to shake things up, do things differently. When Reagan was coming in, the last Republican administration was pursuing détente, kind of trying to manage America's graceful decline, seek parity and arms control with Russia. And Reagan came in and said, no, I think we're strong and they're weak. And the goal is to win the Cold War. We win, they lose. And so that did shake things up early on in his first term, and then led to a successful outcome, ending the Cold War. And I think similar with Trump, I'd put China policy at the top of the list. It would have been easy for somebody from within the system to essentially continue this 25-year strategy we had with China of trying engagement, hoping that continuing to trade with them would mean they become richer, more democratic, more cooperative. Trump came in and said, no, this isn't working. We're going to try something new. We're going to compete. We're going to put in place tariffs. And I do think that took courage. And I'm not sure that, a Hillary Clinton or a Jeb Bush would have done that. So I do think having an outsider come in to shake things up is occasionally helpful, and part of the reason that both Reagan and Trump made such an impression on conservative foreign policy.
Do you think we can expect to see elements of the Reagan or Trump approach in the Biden NSS, which are the national security strategy for our audience, if you're not familiar? Do we expect to see their influence at all?
Well, first thing I'd say is it's, I think it's disappointing that we don't have a national security strategy yet for the Biden administration. We're more than a year in. According to a recent Politico report, with the new senior director of strategic planning coming in, there's going to be something of a rewrite, and they say they expect it by the end of this year. And so I think that's too long. We shouldn't have to wait halfway into an administration to get a strategy. If they got it wrong, if they didn't include Russia as a threat, which is what I'm told partly happened, then it's probably better that they're rewriting it, but it would have been much better to get that right from the beginning. It was obvious, I think, to most that Russia was a threat to its neighbors before February. But are there elements of that populism in Biden's strategy? It's a good question. You know, he's talked about a foreign policy for the middle class. That was a theme during the campaign, a theme in some of his early speeches. I think that was an attempt to try to appeal to some of these Trump voters to get them to come back to the Democratic Party or cross over to the Democratic Party. I'm not really sure what that means, though. What does it mean to have a foreign policy for the middle class? And the Biden administration hasn't really articulated it. So I guess I think there's a desire to appeal to some of those voters, but I'm not really seeing how their foreign policy does that.
Thank you, Matt. And I just want to remind our audience again that you can submit questions at any time to the Q&A, and we will collect those. If they come to mind, go ahead and send them in and we'll ask them at the end. So turning to your previous book, The Return of Great Power Rivalry, in that book, you explored the competition between democracies and autocracies, which is, of course, very relevant today. And the book offers a fairly optimistic take on how the United States might do in this era of great competition. I'm wondering if you could take a moment to briefly share some of your insights from that book with our audience, and tell us if you're still as optimistic and why or why not.
Yes, well, you know, I was motivated to write this book a few years ago because I think there was a lot of pessimism that the American model isn't working, we're dysfunctional, we're gridlocked. And, you know, look at China's state-led capitalist model. Maybe that's the model for the future. And my sense was no, actually, we have enormous strengths, and China's model has real weaknesses. And so did this study looking at democratic versus autocratic competitions going back 2,500 years ago to the Greeks and the Persians, all the way up to today, and did conclude that democracies, you know, have real strengths in these competitions. You know, I didn't fully realize it at the time, but now doing this research for this kind of Reagan-Trump synthesis book, you know, Reagan essentially had the same insights that the Soviet model had fundamental flaws, that our model of free enterprise would outcompete it if we just really competed. And he was right, and I think I have a similar instinct today that the Russian and Chinese models have fundamental flaws. Ours system isn't perfect, but on balance, our system is stronger. And so if we compete, we will ultimately prevail. And I think we're seeing some of that right now in the invasion of Ukraine. I think a lot of the flaws we're seeing in the Russian military are endemic to these autocratic systems. You know, Putin was getting bad advice and had yes men around him. He made a bad decision. We're seeing all these generals getting killed in the field because dictators don't trust their lower level commanders to take initiative. They need to have, you know, command and control sent down into the field, and they're getting put at risk. We see low morale against with the Russian forces, many of them, you know, sabotaging their own equipment so they don't have to fight. So I think Russia does have the typical weaknesses of dictators. And China has these as well, and people might not see them as visibly right now, but they are there.
Yes, and our audience may not be aware of this, but this morning Matt was sanctioned by the Russian government. So that news came in this morning, and Matt can comment on that if he wishes in a moment. But in your book, you do point out that Russia is not as serious a threat to the United States as China, but you've noted recently in a foreign policy piece that the United States at the same time cannot afford to choose between Europe and the Indo-Pacific. Instead, Washington and its allies should develop a defense strategy capable of deterring and, if necessary, defeating Russia and China at the same time. So while recognizing that China is the greater threat, you argue against singularly prioritizing the Indo-Pacific theater. So why is that? Why do you make that case?
Yes, well, first on the Russia sanctions, I just found that out 15 minutes or so before we started and was surprised to see that. And it was on a pretty distinguished list. I'm not sure how I made it. It was Kamala Harris and John Kirby, Pentagon spokesperson, and David Ignatius and some other people like that and me. So honored to be on the list. And it is, I was also censured by the Chinese government and the Iranian government within the past year, so just missing North Korea from my bucket list there. So Russia and China at the same time. I think we're seeing now that Russia is weak, but it is dangerous. If Russia hasn't succeeded in taking all of Ukraine, but it's taken part of it, more than in Estonia or two, for example. So what if Russia were to do this against Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania? It could do this, and we'd have a serious war on our hands. And I think a good strategy starts with clear goals. And the United States does have the goal of maintaining peace and stability in both Europe and Asia. And in fact, while Asia is the rising region, Europe is still our largest trade and investment partner. So just economically right now, Europe is more important than Asia. Also, if we take China out of the equation, people often talk about Asia as the center of economic activity, but largely because of China's growth. So it's not fully a complete thought to say Asia is important because of economics and we should decouple from China. Both of those things can't really be true. So I think Asia and Europe are both important. We can't choose, and we and our allies need a strategy, again, to ideally deter Russia and China, but if necessary, to defend against both at the same time. And I think these extreme kind of Asia-first strategies would be dangerous because we'd be leaving Europe vulnerable, and we can't afford to do that.
So what specific steps should the United States be taking to be able to prioritize both theaters and competition with China more globally? I'm thinking specifically in terms of the defense budget as one example. Could you address that point a bit, and also maybe address the counter argument from folks perhaps in the Asia First school who say it's just logistically not possible for us to prioritize both theaters at once. It's zero sum. Resources devoted to the Asian theater are by necessity not, to the European theater are by necessity not devoted to Asia. So could you address that argument a bit as well?
Yes, maybe I am a bridge builder by nature as well as an optimist by nature, because I do think that there are a lot of things that the Asia First and the kind of walk and chew gum school agree on. I think they do agree that China is the biggest threat. I think they do agree that allies need to do more. I think they do agree that the United States needs to increase defense spending, rely more on nuclear deterrence. So I think there are actually a lot of elements of overlap. But for the arguments that we don't have the resources to do both right now, I would agree, but I don't think the solution is to therefore give up on important strategic goals. I think the big question then becomes, how do you design a strategy and marshal the resources to achieve the goals that you want to achieve? And so I do think the first element of that is increasing defense spending. We only spend about 3% of GDP on defense right now. At the height of the Cold War, we were spending 7%. So not calling for a doubling of the defense budget, but we could double the defense budget and still be below Cold War levels. And given that we may be entering two Cold Wars simultaneous right now with Russia and China increasingly collaborating, I think a significant increase in the defense budget does make sense. Second, I do think it is through greater burden sharing, but I think it's not through the United States, abandoning Europe or the Middle East and saying, you guys take it. I think the United States needs to lead, say, okay, here's the free world strategy for defending against Russia and China at the same time, and telling allies, here's where you fit into the puzzle. Here are the capabilities we really need you to be buying to harpoon missiles for Taiwan, for example. And third and finally, I do think that nuclear deterrence will be an increasingly important piece. During the Cold War, of course, we relied on nuclear deterrence to offset the Soviet Union's conventional advantages in Europe. And so really the defense challenge we face now is that while we have overall conventional superiority relative to Russia or China, they have local advantages. Russia is stronger in Eastern Europe than we are. China is stronger in the Taiwan Strait, or soon will be, than we are. And so one way we can offset that is by relying more on nuclear deterrence and the threat of nuclear first use as a way to offset those advantages. So I do see a way to deal with Russia and China at the same time. And I'd rather try to make that work before giving up important geopolitical regions.
Thank you. And we've seen a lot of debate related to this topic within the United States on how involved America should be in the current crisis in Ukraine. How would you make the case to the American people for why the current war in Ukraine matters for American national security interests?
Yeah, I'd start with first principles, and I'd say the United States, at least since 1945, arguably before, has essentially had a policy of preventing a hostile state from dominating a key geopolitical region. Because when a hostile state dominates a geopolitical region, then the United States itself becomes vulnerable. And we saw that, in World War II with Pearl Harbor. So we're much better having a forward defense, contesting our adversaries over there, so they can't hit us back here. Okay, so then how does that work in Europe? Well, we've got this NATO alliance. It's a great means of containing Russia in Europe, preventing it from dominating the region. And then just look at a map of Europe, look at a map of NATO and Russia, and look at Ukraine. It's a big country, 44 million people between our NATO allies and Russia. If Ukraine falls to Russia, then NATO's eastern flank is much more vulnerable. It becomes harder for us to defend our allies. If Ukraine is part of NATO or is at least neutral, then our job of defending Western Europe, of preventing Russia from dominating Europe, is much easier. So rather fight Russia in Ukraine than in Poland, Germany, or the continental United States.
Yes, and on the topic of European security, we've seen the recent news about Finland and Sweden possibly joining NATO later this year. How would their membership change the state of play for European security, if at all? And is it a net plus for US interests?
Yeah, I think Finland and Sweden joining NATO would be a net plus for US interest. Some of the debates about NATO expansion in the past have said, well, we're letting in these small countries that are essentially indefensible. Does this make sense? That's not the case with Finland and Sweden. These are countries with capable militaries. Finland essentially fought Russia to a draw in the Winter War several decades ago. There's already a lot of military exercises, interoperability between Sweden, Finland, and the United States and the rest of NATO. And again, look at a map. If Finland and Sweden are not part of NATO and there's some kind of war in the Baltic, then we can't really rely on them, and that the northern part of the Baltic Sea is potentially going to be contested. If Finland and Sweden are in NATO, and again, look at a map, essentially the Baltic Sea becomes a NATO lake. And I think we'd be much stronger, much easier to defend the vulnerable Baltic states than we are currently.
Thank you, Matt. And let's turn to Iran a little bit for the end of our discussion. So we've been anticipating the announcement of an Iran deal for some time now here at Vandenberg. Your early work focused quite a bit on nuclear weapons and Iran as well. How nervous should we be about this new deal? What should we expect? What have you been expecting? And what are your greatest concerns?
Well, I am worried about the Iranian nuclear issue. And, right now, Iran is probably closer to having nuclear weapons than it's ever been. David Albright, who's a good expert on these issues, estimates that if Iran sprinted to a nuclear weapons capability, that it would have enough material for its first bomb within about 3 weeks. And that's really the point where the game is over. So we're down to a few weeks. Even in 2012, when this was really the top national security priority, Iran was only 4 or 6 weeks away, so closer now than we've ever been. And it's not getting the attention it deserves, I think, because we have these other bigger fish to fry: war in Europe, the rise of China. But this is important. If Iran gets nuclear weapons, I think it would threaten U.S. allies, bases in the region. Eventually, Iran will have ICBMs like North Korea that could threaten the United States. So I think stopping Iran from building nuclear weapons remains an important national security priority. In terms of the deal, I think the original sin with the Iran nuclear challenge was the interim nuclear deal in 2013 and then the JCPOA in 2015. And the single most important thing to understand, I think, that's often missed in these debates is that there's a big difference between making the fuel, having a truly peaceful nuclear program, operating reactors for energy or for medical isotopes. A big difference between that and making the fuel, uranium enrichment, plutonium reprocessing. Because once you can make the fuel, yes, you can make it for reactors, but you can also make it for bombs. And so US non-proliferation policy, basically going back to Eisenhower, has been to try to draw a sharp line between those things. And say, if you want reactors, no problem, we'll even help you build them, but you can't make the fuel, that's too dangerous. That's even a policy we impose on our own allies. South Korea wants to make nuclear fuel and we say no. The proliferation risk is too great. And that was always the standard with Iran as well. When the nuclear program was first announced, George Bush said no enrichment. We got 6 or 8 UN Security Council resolutions that said no enrichment. Obama came to office saying no enrichment. And then we decided it was too hard and we gave up and we negotiated this deal saying, okay, you can enrich, you can have 2 enrichment facilities, 6,000 centrifuges. And moreover, these limits expire over time. So I think since that decision, we've been in a really hard place. And so I think the new deal we're talking about essentially would be weaker even than the 2015 deal. It would allow Iran to continue to make nuclear fuel. We'd give them additional benefits, maybe even let them off the terrorist organizations list. So I am concerned about the direction of this, and I'm really worried. I've worked on this issue for almost 20 years now. And have really wanted to stop Iran from building nuclear weapons. And unfortunately, I'm afraid that we may watch Iran become a nuclear power in the coming months.
Thank you, Matt. So on the subject of nuclear weapons, you've also written quite a bit on China's nuclear buildup as well. We've seen debate on what exactly is driving this development. What do you think on the subject? What's behind China's nuclear buildup? How will it affect potentially a crisis over Taiwan?
Yeah, so for people who aren't following closely, China's always had a lean and effective nuclear deterrent, is what they've called it, about 200 nuclear weapons. Pentagon projects that they'll have 1,000 nuclear weapons by 2030, so a quintupling or a quadrupling of the size of their arsenal. And so what's driving this? The real answer is we don't know. But I think it's a combination of President Xi saying that he wants China to be a world-class military by 2049. And you can't be a world-class military without a world-class strategic force. So I do think he's trying to build a superpower arsenal to match Russia and the United States. And I do think it's also about the local military strategy. And if they're watching the war in Ukraine now, they'll see, how this works. You can invade your neighbors and make nuclear threats, and the United States is going to be cautious about responding. And so I do think it's about locking the United States more into a kind of mutual vulnerability situation to give them a freer hand to engage in aggression in their neighborhood, including against Taiwan. And so for U.S. strategy, I think this presents really a challenge we've never faced before in our history. Is, in the past, essentially we had to deal with one nuclear peer superpower, Russia. With the Chinese buildup, we're going to have to deal with 2 peer or near peer nuclear superpowers. And so what does that mean for nuclear strategy, for arms control? The short answer is we don't know, but there are people trying to figure it out as we speak.
Great, thank you, Matt. We will now turn to questions from the audience. So we've had several come in, and I'll ask a few. The first one is when describing the pillars of how you see conservative foreign policy moving forward, you mentioned, quote, American exceptionalism. How does merely embracing this stance advance our foreign policy objectives, particularly when they often require parity and collaboration with allies? Could you perhaps elaborate on what you think affirming the idea of exceptionalism will help achieve? Yeah, we'll stop there.
Yeah, good question. Well, first, I'm not a politician and probably wouldn't be a good one, but I do think that appealing to the American people is an important part of a good foreign policy. And I do, I grew up in St. Louis, Missouri. I do think that Americans think that their country's special. If you tell them, you're just like Greece, they don't buy it. And it's not true. The United States is an exceptional country, largest economy on earth since the 1800s, most powerful military since the 1940s. The leader in terms of innovation and a lot of measures of soft power. And the American democratic experiment really inspired and continues to inspire many. So I think it is a special country. When it comes to foreign policy and working with allies, as I said, I think working with allies is important. But I think there's a way you can persuade. Allies don't need a lot of persuading of this. They want American leadership, and when there were concerns about the United States withdrawing from the world, and I think we've seen those concerns certainly from Obama and the Obama administration. Concerns in the Trump administration, concerns in the Biden administration, like the withdrawal from Afghanistan. Often it's the rest of the world saying, no, we want more America, not less. So I think they understand that American leadership is important as well. But I think the way you articulated, which is really what we want to do, is it's not America, doing it on its own. It's America leading alongside allies and partners, because if we withdraw, if we don't lead, the smaller allies aren't going to do it on their own. I think it does require the United States. We're the only country with the capabilities and with the broad appeal that can really lead a broad coalition of nations to accomplish things in the world. And again, our smaller allies can't do that, and certainly the revisionist autocratic great powers can't do that. And so the United States just simply is exceptional in that way.
Thank you, Matt. And the next audience question is sort of related. Should conservative foreign policy base itself on conservative ideals, such as freedom, small government, liberalism, or have at its core IR theories, such as realism? And this audience member says, it seems to me that emphasizing one over the other will lead to different grand strategies.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. First, I'll take the IR theory piece. I am a PhD in political science and a tenured political science professor at Georgetown. The two major IR theories, realism basically emphasizes power, liberalism emphasizes democracy, institutions, globalization. And, I was a benighted political scientist when I arrived in Washington 20 or so years ago. And my first thought was, oh, these policymakers don't get it. Like they're talking about power and the importance of alliances, but they're also talking about values and, free trade. And, are they realist or are they liberals? After 20 years in this town, I've realized that often it's actually the practitioners who really do get it and the theorists who are mistaken. And I think this is a good example of that. I think realistically, to understand American foreign policy, to understand America's role in the world over the past 70 years, you can't escape the conclusion that power matters and values matter. It's not one or the other, it's both. In terms of traditional conservative values, I do think that U.S. foreign policy and conservative foreign policy is motivated by that. So free markets, I think, is a traditional part of conservative domestic politics, and also part of, I think, conservative foreign policy. The Republican Party has often been in favor of free trade. As I said, I think that needs to be updated now. In terms of what is conservative, what are conservative principles? My friend and colleague Matthew Cranig at AEI has a new book out called The Right, where he talks about this. But he says, what are conservatives conserving in the United States? And he says essentially it is the liberal values of the revolution. And the kind of the American founding moment. And so this belief in individual liberty and freedom, I think, is an important part of that, has also been an important part of conservative foreign policy. And then, even if you're in favor of limited government, the Constitution, says, I think in the very first line that providing for the common defense is one of the things that the government will do. And if the government doesn't provide for the national defense, we don't have a strong military. There's no private actor that's going to step up and do that. So I guess I do think that conservative foreign policy does spring forth from its principles.
Great, thank you. And turning to a different subject from the audience, we have a question on Ukraine. Why do you think so many conservatives are so vocal in their opposition to providing aid to Ukraine, while at the same time sort of prioritizing US border security? So the argument, I think this person is asking about the argument that's sort of percolating out there that the United States should be more concerned about the southern border than the borders of Ukraine.
Yeah, so 2 points on this. One, if you look at Republican leaders in Washington, I think there is a lot of support for Ukraine right now. I know Kevin McCarthy just led a delegation to Eastern Europe. I think there's bipartisan support to giving the Ukrainians more weapons and more aid. So I do think it's a minority of the Republican Party, a vocal minority, but a minority that's skeptical about getting involved in Ukraine. And so you're right. One of the arguments they've made is, why do we care about Ukraine's borders when we don't take our own borders seriously? And I think they have a point. Ukraine's borders are not more important than American borders. But I think the solution is not to say, okay, so we'll do the southern border and not Ukraine. I think the solution is to do both. And I think we can do both. And actually, my dad raised this question to me: why do we care about Ukraine when we don't care about the southern border? And this is what I told him: let's do both. Both are important.
Back to the walk and chew gum argument as well. So another audience question, this time on nuclear weapons. So this person says, you mentioned using our nukes as an offset for conventional inferiority. Doesn't this desire get complicated by China's massive nuclear buildup, Russia's threats to use nuclear weapons, and its continuing modernization of its nuclear arsenal, and our lack of nuclear options? So starting to get nervous with this question. What changes to our nuclear arsenal and posture would you suggest to mitigate this problem?
Well, great question. And you're right, it is. Those are all challenges. On the first couple of challenges, Russian and Chinese buildup, the thing I would say there is that Russia and China are afraid of nuclear war too. They don't want a nuclear war with the United States. And I think sometimes maybe the Biden administration is at risk of forgetting that. They're so worried about constraining our options in Ukraine so as to avoid escalation. But Putin wants to avoid escalation as well. If we provide, say, MiG fighters to Ukraine, Putin's not going to suddenly say, today's a good day for nuclear war. So that's point one. We are in this, we are all vulnerable to nuclear war. So Russia and China are afraid of it as well. So that's where I think the theater nuclear weapons become really important. And I think the questioner is right that we do have a deficit there. And so, in order to offset the Russian and Chinese conventional advantages, I think we do need more non-strategic nuclear options. So after Russia invaded Ukraine for the first time in 2014, I began advocating for non-strategic nuclear weapons to deal with the Russian escalate to de-escalate challenge in Europe, wrote a number of pieces about it, testified before Congress. And the Trump administration in 2018 did put in place these two new low-yield nuclear weapons. And I think that's right. Unfortunately, the Biden administration in their nuclear posture review is killing off one of these weapons now, the nuclear slickum. The Wall Street Journal had an op-ed today that quoted me, by the way, but that said this is a mistake, that we do need these capabilities, and that's right, this is a mistake. So these kind of low yield capabilities are helpful in Russia and would be helpful in China and Indo-Pacific. But I think that they're not enough, actually. I think rather than cutting, we should be thinking about what are the other types of non-strategic capabilities we would need. And I think having some low yield ground launch nuclear capabilities, now that we're out of the INF treaty, could make sense, especially in Asia. And I also think having an air launch low yield nuclear weapon, a kind of nuclear JASM, if people know what a conventional JASM air launch missile is like, would also be helpful, especially in the NATO and Europe context. So yes, you're right. We need to address that non-strategic nuclear deficit to make that a part of the strategy work.
Thanks, Matt. And we have a question coming in actually from one of our advisory board members, Scott Carpenter, who said, where do the big US tech firms fit into the future of the US national security strategy in your view?
Well, thank you, Scott, for listening in and for that question. I mean, I do think this new tech arms race is really a critical piece of great power competition. You know, the United States has essentially been the world's innovation leader since Thomas Edison, and it's provided us enormous economic, military, geopolitical advantages. But you know, we're in a new race with China, and China may be beating us in certain applications of artificial intelligence, quantum computing, hypersonic missiles. And so this is really concerning. If China wins this new tech arms race of the future, the economic, military, geopolitical advantages that we've traditionally enjoyed may go to China. So I don't think we can prevail in great power competition unless we maintain our traditional edge. For the big tech giants, I know there are these debates you know, now over regulation and other things. I'm not the deepest expert in this yet, although I want to dig into it more. But my sense is that our traditional strength in innovation has really come because of our free market system, because we don't have a lot of government intervention. You know, so some are saying, well, we should copy the Chinese model and have more of an industrial policy. And I think at the margins, some tax incentives, some investments do make sense. But I don't think we want to copy China's model. I do think that our innovation model has proven successful for, you know, for really centuries. And we want to maintain that model. So my sense is that the government intervening in this, regulating the tech companies too much is probably a mistake, but it is something that I want to dig into more.
Thanks, Matt. And the next question I'm going to ask is from Hank Meyer, who is actually Arthur Vandenberg's biographer. He's written a fantastic book on Arthur Vandenberg that I would encourage all of our audience members to read. He was pointing out in the chat that the unifying value of American exceptionalism depends upon presidential salesmanship that a bipartisan majority in Congress can accept. Is that true? Could you comment on that a bit, sort of the role of both Congress and the president in leading on this issue?
Yeah, well, thank you, Hank, again, for tuning in and for the question. And I've heard you speak on your good book on Vandenberg in the past. So thanks for writing that book. You know, and I think you're right that to get anything done, and certainly to have a sustainable national security strategy, having bipartisan support is helpful. And, you know, we've seen examples of where that doesn't work, you know, with the Iran nuclear deal, trying a new strategy every 4 years hasn't served us well. In other areas like nuclear modernization, where we do have a bipartisan consensus, you can keep things on track for, you know, across multiple administrations. So I think you're right, having the kind of presidential leadership, pursuing policies that can win bipartisan support is the way to go. And I think the question was about exceptionalism in particular. I actually do think that, you know, this is a subject that you can win over centrist Democrats on. You know, I think Hillary Clinton believed in American exceptionalism. Obama maybe did not, but I think that centrist Democrats do. And so yes, I think we can build a bipartisan coalition around that vision, and it does take leadership.
Thank you, Matt. I think we have time for a few more questions. Clifford May is also on the Vandenberg Advisory Board, is asking, Matt Pottinger, who we had on for our last session in this series, has said that a new Cold War has effectively been declared against us. Do you see it as useful for us to conceive and acknowledge that Cold War, a second Cold War, is now underway?
Yes, well, thanks for joining, Cliff, and great question. I think there has been a lot of this kind of semantic debate: is it a Cold War or not? And I think if we mean, is this the exact thing we went through from 1945 to 1991, then the answer is clearly no. But if what we mean is is this going to be a protracted great power competition across all domains of national power, economic, military, ideological, then yes, I do think we're in a new Cold War, and maybe not just one Cold War, but maybe two, Russia and China at the same time, maybe with them increasingly collaborating. So I think that getting back into that kind of mindset of competition, that the Cold War mindset, seeing things through the lens of that competition, does make sense. And you're right. I think it was declared upon us. The United States, after the end of the first Cold War, I think really was hopeful, maybe naive, that by engaging with Russia and China, that they could become responsible stakeholders in a rules-based system. And clearly, Putin and Xi have different ideas. They think they benefit by challenging the United States and the system that we've built. And so I think the challenge before us, the way we win this competition, is essentially by convincing the next generation of Russian and Chinese leaders, or maybe the generation after that, that Xi and Putin's approach failed. That challenging the United States and its allies is too difficult, too costly, that actually Beijing and Moscow are better off by pursuing a more cooperative approach. And again, tying us back to the beginning of the talk, I think that's an instinct that Reagan had. We'll beat the Soviet Union now in order to cooperate in the future. And I think that wisdom would also serve us well for this new Cold War that we're embarking upon.
Thank you. And we actually had a related question from the audience related to the new growing axis between Russia and China. So this person is asking, if the US were to negotiate strategic arms control agreements between the United States, Russia, and China, the first part of the question is, should the goal be that each state have parity, i.e. 1,000, 1,000, 1,000, or each alliance bloc have parity? Would treating Russia and China as an alliance bloc be possibly damaging to future attempts to create a split between Russia and China?
Yes, it's a rich question. So, the way the United States has traditionally done arms control is we say, okay, what do we need for nuclear deterrence? And essentially the way we've done that is count up the targets in Russia and China, other adversaries that we need to hold at risk with our nuclear weapons. How many weapons do we need to cover those targets? And that's the number we need. And then if we have excess above that, then that's the room for arms control. Unfortunately, when we look at this massive Chinese buildup, if we count the targets we need to hold at risk, the number we have right now in New START with our arms control agreement is 1,550. So this was a number negotiated in 2010. If you look at the nuclear security environment today in 2022, and especially where it's going in 2030, it's clear that 1,550 isn't enough. I think the United States is going to have to expand the size of its strategic arsenal, and so that will mean New START will either have to be negotiated or expire, or we pull out of it. And so, this raises the big problem of tripolarity that I discussed before, because if we do 1,000, 1,000, 1,000, that'll essentially mean, it'll depend on the details, but essentially that the United States can't cover all the targets that it needs to cover. So I don't think that model works. If we could lump Russia and China together and say, we'll have parity with both of you combined, that might work. I don't know why Russia and China would go for that. So, if we look back to the Cold War, going back to this comparison again, essentially we didn't get real arms control until several decades into the first Cold War. And I think it was because we had this extended arms competition and both sides decided, okay, well, we've achieved what we can through this, let's negotiate some caps. And so going forward, I suspect we'll see something similar, that actually we're in for a couple of decades of arms competition, and maybe in 2050 or something, or 2040, we'll be ready for some serious arms control. But it's very hard for me to imagine US, Russia, China arms control in the foreseeable future.
Great. Well, I think we should probably stop there for today. Matt, thank you so much for being here and for participating in this series. It was a great conversation on many different topics, from China to Russia, Iran, and nuclear weapons. So we greatly appreciate your willingness to participate today. And thank you as well to our audience members. And we invite you all to come back next week for a conversation with Bridge Colby. So Matt, thank you so much. We greatly appreciate it.
Well, it was really an honor and a pleasure. Thanks for having me. Thanks for the participants and distinguished participants and your great questions. And I'll look forward to watching the rest of the episodes in the series.
Great. Thank you, Matt.